Welcome back, everyone, for another deep dive. This time, we're going to be looking at lawmaking and interpretation in the UK.
Specifically, how those two things kind of come head to head in the courtroom.
Yeah, and the source material that we're working with here is kind of interesting. It's a combination of a lecture transcript and some course notes.
About different legal systems.
Yeah, so get ready to really kind of untangle this relationship between Parliament and judges and how something as basic as, like, words
Can have a big impact.
huge implications. Yeah.
So words are the building blocks of the law, right?
Yeah, so let's start with this idea of parliamentary supremacy. That sounds pretty straightforward. Parliament makes the laws everybody follows.
Well, in theory, yes.
Yeah.
That's the cornerstone of the UK Constitution.
Okay.
The courts are bound by what Parliament creates, even if they disagree with them.
Wow. Okay, so Parliament's the top dog.
In theory, their power is absolute.
Yeah.
The lecture even uses the word omnipotent.
Omnipotent.
Wow.
Okay, but then in the notes, they mentioned the European Convention on Human Rights and how that has an impact.
Well, that's where the absolute power gets a little bit more complicated.
Okay.
Because the UK courts also have to make sure that laws are compatible with those human rights protections.
I see.
So it's a bit of a balancing act.
It's a hot topic right now, too, actually, because one of the candidates for Conservative Party leader is suggesting that if he gets elected, he's going to pull the UK out of the convention.
Oh, wow.
Imagine the legal shakeup that would cause.
Yeah, it would really challenge a lot of legal precedents, that's for sure.
Yeah.
But moving on, let's talk about something that kind of surprised me, which is this idea of delegated legislation.
Yeah, I was surprised by that, too.
It turns out that a ton of lawmaking happens outside of Parliament.
It's like Parliament gives somebody else the power to write a whole chapter of the legal rule book.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. They can authorize other entities like government ministers or local councils to make laws on their behalf.
Okay.
And these are called delegated legislation.
So they cover a huge range of things.
They do.
They mentioned in here, like, even stuff as specific as when you can walk your dog on a beach.
That's right.
Okay, so that's delegated legislation in action.
Yeah.
It makes sense that Parliament doesn't really have time to debate every little detail, but they said something like 2,000 of these are passed every year.
It's a lot, isn't it?
That's a lot flying under the radar.
Yeah, it does raise concerns about scrutiny, because these delegated laws aren't debated and voted on in the same way as laws made directly by Parliament.
Yeah, public awareness can be an issue, I bet.
Absolutely.
Okay, so we've got Parliament making the big laws, delegating some of the smaller ones, and then we have the judges.
Right.
And they're kind of left to figure out how these laws actually work in practice.
Yeah, their job is to interpret the law, not to create it,
Okay.
which means working within the framework that's set by Parliament.
That can't be easy, though. Words can be slippery things. What happens if a word in a law is ambiguous or the meaning's changed over time?
Well, that's where statutory interpretation comes in. And it's a lot trickier than you might think. Judges have to grapple with the limitations of language.
I see.
The fact that language evolves.
Yeah.
It's a challenge.
So give us an example. What kind of real-world headaches does this actually cause?
Well, you've got the case of Mrs. Berryman back in 1946.
Okay.
And she ended up in court arguing over the meaning of the word repair in a statute.
Oh, wow.
And because of how the judges interpreted that word,
Yeah.
Mrs. Berryman actually lost her case.
Oh, wow. A single word having such a huge impact on someone's life just because of how it was interpreted.
That's right.
Makes you realize how much power judges really have.
They do. Their understanding of the words in a statute can have very real and sometimes unfortunate consequences. And it's not just old cases either. Think about the Dangerous Dogs Act.
Yeah.
The fact that they used the word type instead of breed
Oh, yeah, I remember that.
created a lot of confusion.
There was all this debate about which dogs were actually covered by the law because type is so much broader than breed.
Exactly. And then you have those examples where the law itself becomes outdated, like that case from the 1970s where injunctions only applied to married women.
It's a good thing times have changed.
Yeah.
Makes you realize how much society evolves
Absolutely.
and how laws have to keep up.
And it's often the courts that are bridging that gap between the language of the law and the realities of modern life.
Okay, so how do judges even approach this? Do they just wing it when a word is unclear?
Mm-hmm.
Or there's some guidelines they follow?
Well, thankfully, there are guidelines. Over the centuries, judges have developed a set of rules
Okay.
to guide their interpretation of statutes.
Mm.
They're called the Rules of Statutory Interpretation.
Okay.
And they provide a framework for how to approach ambiguous or unclear language.
So judges made their own rule book for understanding the rule book.
Essentially, yes.
That's pretty meta.
It is. But it's important to remember that Parliament can always step in and overturn a judicial interpretation it doesn't like by passing new legislation.
Okay.
It doesn't happen often, though.
So in most cases, the judges get the final say.
For the most part, yes. And that brings us to a pretty fascinating point, which is that by interpreting the law, judges are shaping and evolving it, even though their primary role is application.
Hold on. I thought Parliament makes the laws and judges simply apply them.
Yeah.
It's not that black and white.
Not quite. Choosing which interpretive approach to use
Right.
and which, meaning to prioritize, gives judges quite a lot of influence over how the law is understood and applied.
It sounds almost like an artistic process.
Yeah.
Like molding the clay of a statute into a specific shape based on how they interpret it.
That's a good analogy. Statutory interpretation is a creative process. And it highlights this inherent tension that exists between the fixed words of a statute and the fluidity of real-world situations.
So it's not just about finding the right definition in a dictionary.
Yeah.
Judges have to consider context, intent, and even a little bit of legal intuition to figure things out.
Absolutely. And they also have to consider the potential consequences of their decisions, remembering that the law impacts real people's lives.
That's a lot of pressure. It makes you wonder, if Parliament has this ultimate power, shouldn't they be more involved in clarifying laws when they've proven to be ambiguous?
That's a good question. And it leads to another one. Does the flexibility of judicial interpretation actually allow the legal system to adapt more effectively? Maybe overly rigid laws would actually hinder the law's ability to stay relevant
I see.
in a constantly changing world.
So it's a trade-off.
Yeah.
Clear legislation versus adaptable interpretation.
Precisely. It's all a balancing act. And it really makes you appreciate the fact that the UK legal system is constantly evolving, shaped by the interplay between Parliament, the courts, and even something as basic as how language changes over time.
It's a lot more complex than I ever realized. But this is just the beginning. We've got a lot more to unpack.
Yeah, it's a dynamic system for sure. It really makes you realize that law isn't just this static set of rules.
Right.
It's this living, breathing thing that's constantly being interpreted and reinterpreted.
And to think that something as simple as like a single word can have such a huge impact on somebody's life.
Yeah, it speaks to the power of language and the responsibility that comes with using it, not just for lawmakers, but for judges, too.
Yeah, it makes you wonder if lawmakers need a crystal ball to see how the words they use today might be interpreted years down the line.
Well, they do have to try and anticipate how language and society might evolve.
Right.
But that's where the courts come in to make sure that the law stays relevant and adaptable.
So judges are kind of like translators in a way, taking the language of the past and making it meaningful in the present.
I like that analogy. Yeah, they're constantly bridging that gap between the fixed words of a statute and the ever-changing realities of the cases that are in front of them.
It's like they're deciphering a code.
Right.
Trying to understand the intent behind the words and apply them in a way that makes sense.
Exactly. And just like with any translation, there's always room for interpretation. Different perspectives, different understandings.
Which brings us back to that creative process that we were talking about.
Yeah.
It's not just about finding the one true definition of a word.
No.
But understanding how it fits within the bigger picture of the law.
Right.
And society as a whole.
Exactly. Judges have to consider the historical context, the intent of the law, the potential consequences of different interpretations, and even the evolving values of society.
So it's not just about legal technicalities then.
No.
It's also about the human story behind the law.
Absolutely. That's why it's so important to have judges who are not only experts in the law, but also possess wisdom, empathy, a deep understanding of human nature.
The notes mention something about Lord Diplock said about judges needing to figure out Parliament's intention.
Yeah.
What did he mean by that?
It's a key principle of statutory interpretation.
Okay.
The idea is that judges shouldn't get hung up on the literal meaning of words, but should try to understand what Parliament was trying to achieve, the spirit of the law.
So they're trying to get into the minds of the lawmakers.
In a way, yes.
Sounds tricky.
It can be,
Yeah.
but it really highlights the collaborative nature of the legal system. Parliament and the courts are in constant dialogue,
Okay.
each influencing the other
Right.
in this cycle of lawmaking and interpretation.
It's like a dance.
Yeah.
Parliament is leading,
Yeah.
courts are following, but adding their own flair to the steps.
That's a great way to put it.
Right.
And just like with any good dance,
Yeah.
the outcome is something that's both beautiful and purposeful.
I love that. It really captures that dynamic tension
Yeah.
and that creative interplay
Absolutely.
between these two branches of government.
And it reminds us that law isn't just a bunch of rigid rules,
Right?
but a reflection of our shared values, our evolving understanding of justice, and our desire to create a fair and equitable society.
Well, this whole deep dive has really opened my eyes to the power of words
Yeah.
and how they shape our legal reality.
It's true. And remember, we're only scratching the surface here.
Oh, I know.
There are entire libraries dedicated to this stuff,
Right.
delving even deeper into all the nuances and complexities of statutory interpretation.
It's definitely something I'll be looking into.
Yeah.
But for now, let's dive into those judge-made rules for understanding statutes.
Okay.
What are these rules of statutory interpretation all about?
Well, think of them like tools in a judge's toolkit.
Okay.
They're designed to help judges make sense of ambiguous language
Mm-hmm.
and arrive at the most reasonable and just interpretation of the law.
And the fascinating thing is that these rules were developed by judges themselves, right?
That's right.
So like through centuries of dealing with these tricky legal questions, they came up with their own system.
Yeah, it shows the adaptability of the common law system.
Right.
Judges recognized the need for a framework to guide their decisions.
Yeah.
So they created one.
It's like they built their own scaffolding to help them reach those higher levels of legal understanding.
That's a good way to put it.
So what are some examples of these rules and how are they actually used?
Well, you've got the literal rule,
Okay.
which focuses on giving words their plain, ordinary meaning.
Okay, so if a law says no vehicles in the park, that means no cars, no trucks, no motorcycles.
In theory,
Yes.
simple enough.
But what about a bicycle
Oh.
or a child's toy car?
Hmm.
That's where the literal rule can sometimes lead to outcomes that seem a bit absurd or unfair.
So I'm guessing there are other rules that allow for a bit more flexibility.
Exactly. You have the golden rule,
Okay.
which allows judges to deviate from the literal meaning if it would lead to a result that's absurd
Right.
or just plain wrong.
So in our no vehicles example, a judge using the golden rule might decide that a kid's toy car isn't quite the same thing as like a speeding motorcycle.
Exactly. Makes sense, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. What other tools are in the box?
We also have the mischief rule.
Which focuses on the problem or the mischief that the law was trying to address.
So if the purpose of the no vehicles rule was to create a safe and peaceful environment for pedestrians, a judge might interpret it to allow for certain quiet, non-motorized vehicles.
Exactly.
Okay.
And it highlights how these rules can be used to ensure that the law is applied in a way that's both sensible and just, taking context and intent into consideration.
It's like having different lenses to look at a law, each one revealing a different aspect of its meaning and purpose.
And a skilled judge knows how to use those lenses effectively, choosing the right one for each case.
But what happens if Parliament disagrees with the judge's interpretation?
Oh, well, Parliament always has the final say.
Okay.
They can step in, clarify, or amend a law if they feel a judge has misinterpreted it.
So it's a system of checks and balances.
That's right.
Parliament sets the overall direction, but the courts have some flexibility in how they interpret and apply the law.
Exactly. That balance is crucial to the smooth functioning of the legal system. Ensures that the law remains both responsive to societal needs and grounded in democratic principles. It's a fascinating dance.
It really is. We've covered so much ground already, and I think our listener is starting to grasp just how complex this interplay is between Parliament, the courts, and the very words that make up our legal system.
It's an important understanding to have.
Yeah.
It empowers us to engage critically with the laws that affect our lives, to question their meaning and even advocate for change when necessary.
We're not just passive recipients of the law.
No.
We can be active participants in shaping it.
Exactly. And remember, this deep dive is just the beginning.
Oh, I know.
There's so much more to learn for those who are curious.
I know. I'm definitely feeling more curious.
Yeah.
But for now, let's shift gears a little bit and look at some real-world examples of how these statutory interpretation challenges play out. That's where things get really interesting. Let's dive into some cases. All right, let's revisit poor Mrs. Berryman. A single word cost her a compensation claim, all because of how the judges defined repair.
It really shows that words have consequences, you know? Their interpretation can have real-world impact. It makes you think, too. Did societal context play a role in that case? What was considered repair back in 1946
Right.
might be seen very differently today.
Yeah, it makes you wonder, would the outcome be different if that case were heard now?
Possibly.
Our understanding of language changes.
It does.
Legal interpretations change.
Absolutely. And speaking of evolving language,
Yeah.
let's talk about the Dangerous Dogs Act.
Okay.
The notes mentioned how using type instead of breed
Yeah.
created a whole lot of legal uncertainty.
Type is so much broader than breed.
It is.
It's no wonder there was so much confusion about which dogs were actually covered by the law.
Exactly. The act wanted to restrict dangerous dog ownership.
Right?
But by defining them by type, it left things wide open to interpretation.
It did.
Made consistent enforcement really difficult.
Did they ever fix it?
Well,
Did Parliament ever go back and change the wording to breed?
the lecture mentioned that Parliament was revisiting the issue, possibly because of all the controversy around breeds like the American Bully XL. Interesting.
It seems like public pressure and evolving social perceptions can sometimes be the catalyst for change.
It's a good reminder that lawmaking is an ongoing process.
It is.
Sometimes you need to go back and tweak the language,
You do.
make sure that it's achieving what it's supposed to.
That's right.
It's kind of like debugging code, but for law.
That's a great analogy.
Yeah.
And speaking of outdated language,
Yeah.
what about that example from the 1970s?
Oh, yeah.
Where only married women could get injunctions against domestic violence?
I know. Times have certainly changed.
Thankfully.
It's mind-boggling to think that was ever the case.
I know.
Thankfully, the law has evolved to reflect a more inclusive understanding of relationships and rights. It has. But it took legal challenges
Right.
and a reinterpretation of existing laws to get there.
It did.
Yeah.
It's a great example of how the judiciary can play a really vital role in adapting the law to reflect changing values in society.
Absolutely.
So after this deep dive into the UK legal system, what would you say is the key takeaway for our listener?
Well, I think the biggest takeaway is that law is a living, breathing thing.
Yeah.
It's not static. It's not set in stone. It's constantly evolving
Right.
through reinterpretation, adaptation.
Like a river, isn't it? Always flowing, always changing, but still following a course.
I love that. And just like a river, we as citizens play a role in shaping its flow.
Right.
We can be part of informed discussions,
Yeah.
challenge interpretations that seem outdated or unfair,
Right.
and advocate for changes that align with our values.
Because ultimately the law should reflect who we are as a society and protect the rights of everyone.
Precisely. And by understanding the power of words and the complexities of interpretation, we can make sure that the law continues to be a force for good, for justice, fairness, progress.
Well, this deep dive has given us all a lot to think about. It's amazing how something as seemingly simple as a word can have such a profound impact on our legal reality. Thanks for joining us, and keep those legal minds churning.